That probably underscores why it's so important how the final assessments end up, because if it really does become just a rote process, a plug in of the formula kind of thing, then we really are de-emphasizing some of what has made us so unique.
That's exactly right. And there are conversations going on now between math educators and the people in the assessment consortia as they start to look toward uh, generating these tests. I mean, I will say this. It is a little frightening that we're on this runaway train, if you will. I mean, these tests are going to be done in September of 2014.
Right.
And that's very fast because they have to be, they have to have some prototypes, then they have to do field testing, and they've got to norm them to make sure that they're legitimate and
Sure.
psychometrically. So there's like a year basically between now and the generation, what, 49,000 items or something like that. And who's going to make those tests? These tests are going to be let out. The RFPs are going to go to the big test makers, and that's going to be Pearson or ETS or whoever. And they're worried as much about validity as they are about the nature of what we're testing. So
Absolutely.
we are in fact engaged in that conversation. The test makers and the math educators are engaged, and hopefully that engagement will lead to better exams and will lead to what we were all hoping for.
Okay, so when you say that you've been engaged in that conversation, or mathematicians have been engaged in that, are you referencing the for-profit companies that you're engaged in the conversation with, or are you talking about the two test consortiums that have evolved as a result of this? Who exactly is
Right.
involved in the
We're talking
conversation?
about the consortia that
Okay.
received the funding from the Department of Education, the PARC Consortium and the Smarter Balance Consortium. These are the two major consortia that received funding. And I should mention it's not just for mathematics, it's also for English language arts and eventually science and other things. So I'm talking about those. They, in fact, in turn, right now are in the process of writing an RFPs out so that the big test makers, the companies, the for-profit companies, can bid on actually creating the items. What we're trying to do is help them write those RFPs so that when someone applies to get the funding to write the items, they have to agree that those items will be more like the ones we would hope to see than they might be otherwise. So we're trying to affect that change.
Okay, interesting. One of the things that we've had, the state board in Kansas has had a lot of attention on, has been the idea of the career and college ready, and it's pretty much in line, and they were talking about that even before Obama's administration was discussing that. One of the concerns that I have often is that it feels to me like we continue to channel kids and force them to take college prep curriculums just in case that's the avenue that they need to explore, kind of thing. I'm wondering what the outcomes of the standards might be on that, in terms of allowing kids to really explore and have all options available to them as a result of their K-12 education.
Okay, so now my politics will show.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't agree more. I think that it is absolutely silly to call these college and career readiness standards. They are college readiness standards. I think that if you looked at the world of work, and I've done some projects where I've gone into companies and I've looked at the math they use, the math they need. I've actually studied this at some length. It's not what's in these standards. These standards are about getting into colleges, and I think it's a terrible mistake. I think that given where we are now, we may have to. I don't want to use the word track, but we may have to do something that recognizes the fact that you can get into careers and do work with a lot different kinds of mathematics. I mean, there is still enormous emphasis here on algebraic manipulations and skills, which no one is going to need. I mean, in very, very few industry companies, and I'm talking about reasonably good jobs. I'm not
Yes.
talking about pumping gas or working a pizza parlor. I'm talking about serious work in high tech companies. Nobody solves quadratic equations for a living. I don't care, except people who teach it.
Yeah.
So the idea that you emphasize all these manipulative skills when there are all these other interesting things things and topics and more advanced topics in statistics and quality control, operations research, inventory, just-in-time kinds of queuing theory. All of these kinds of topics are much more useful when you go out into the job market. And I think that these standards ignore that because they're thinking about college placement exams as they exist now, preparation for calculus, and so on, and that sort of track from birth to a PhD, that linear set of courses. I just think it's a mistake. And I think we'll be back here rewriting these standards, or at least rewriting the career readiness standards, because I think that this is all about getting into college, and that's not everybody, and it shouldn't be everybody. And I think that, again, they were worried. I think the writers were worried the colleges would be angry if they left out topic A that they have on their introductory courses. And so it was all about preparation to get into college. There were no people in the workplace who were looking at these standards. Nobody. Yeah. I mean, you look at those. Look at the companies. Look at the people who are on those boards. You don't see career readiness experts. So I think it's a mistake. I think it was, and I think it's a mistake that we'll pay for. But I would say this: my experience from talking to people is that these standards may not be set in stone. Even though people talk about them like we did it, it's over, forget it, now let's go implement them. I actually think there may be an opportunity for these to be revised somewhat. Certainly someone should be looking at them at some point and saying, is this working? I mean, I know that may take 5 or 10 years, but I'm hopeful that actually in the shorter term, there may be additional work done on the standards, in particular in the career readiness area.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective a little bit, because I too am concerned about that, because there are many avenues of for careers for kids, all of which have great worth, and not all of them. In fact, the workforce probably requires less than 40, maybe 40% of the folks in the workforce really need a college degree to do the jobs that we need to have done. So yeah, it's a great perspective. Just kind of in closing a little bit then, if the standards are here, and there's probably some really great things that will happen, and there are probably some challenges that we're going to encounter, but because they're already in place, what advice might you give to school administrators who are at the stage where they need to help their staff implement the standards? Where would you recommend that they start?
Well, again, my own bias, I think they start with the practices. They have to look at those practices and say to themselves and say to their constituents, what does this mean in the classroom? I mean, what does this mean Monday? How do we do this? I mean, I think that teachers really don't administrators really don't understand that yet. And so I would start from those practices and think about, again, back to what you said, how do we teach this stuff? It isn't what it is. Of course, there will be some instances where teachers simply want to understand some of the content, and they'll have to help, especially at the elementary level. But I do think that it's the how that we have to focus on and use those practices as our guide. And that's my best advice.
That may be our real opportunity in all of this, so I appreciate you kind of pulling it together with that, because the reality is it is about how we approach it. It isn't about what it is that we're teaching. If we're really educating students at high levels, they should be self-directed learners and able to go out and use what it is, the processes that we've taught them to further their own education.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Garfunkel, for your time and your thoughts. You've certainly given a lot of food for thought or a little bit of food for thought for folks as we move forward in these standards, and perhaps we'll have a conversation again in the future.
I would look forward to it. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.